had zero expectations about this, and yet it surprised me so much. It is time for our story analysis of the Forgotten Saga game mode for Assassin's Creed Valhalla that so many of you asked us about in the last few days. In the first of this two-part video, we're going to have a look at the historical narrative featuring Eivor, the introduction to the story taking place in the Isu Era featuring Odin, and the ties it has to the Dawn of Ragnarok DLC, before moving on to share our interpretation of what Muninn, the bosses and NPCs, and especially Niflheim and Odin's loop of dying and being reborn actually are beyond the mythological veil, and how all of that does seem to make proper sense within the Assassin's Creed lore. So let's jump in. This is the first part of our analysis of the Forgotten Saga game mode of Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Before we start, I just want to say that I absolutely was not prepared to witness how much I enjoyed the Forgotten Saga mode. I wasn't. I guess you could have seen that by the video that we published a few hours before it released. My expectation was to find another vague mythology-based content, a generic one because it was said that anyone could get its story without playing Dawn of Ragnarok, and a repetitive, even weird one because it seemed to be focused on a foolish conquest by Odin in an attempt to defy fate. And I can't say how wrong I was, because the game mode is really enjoyable, it is compelling, you have a lot of fun, it is pretty replayable to a certain degree, and it also features a story that, at least according to my interpretation, makes sense within the established Isu meta story. But at the same time, I also can't state how wrong Ubisoft was in releasing those statements and those comments, because this story is a direct sequel to Dawn of Ragnarok, and while you can get the semblance of a surface level narrative without playing the DLC first, you can't grasp what is really happening without actually playing and getting to its end, and also there is no conquest happening here whatsoever. I really don't know where they got that. So yeah, my personal recommendation is to either play Dawn of Ragnarok or check our story analysis of the DLC, not only to brush up on the events leading up to this, but also because a number of elements from that story bear consequence on the start of this one and also later on. In addition to that, for fans that might still not know, here's a reminder that all the events shown in the mythological arcs and content of Assassin's Creed Valhalla are actually stories from the Isu Era involving members of the first civilization that are actually coated by what we call the Mythological Veil, which is pretty much how Eivor is processing Odin's genetic memories through her own understanding of the Norse mythology. Alright, with all that out of the way, we can finally start. But we're not going to do it directly from the Isu narrative. In fact, as it's mostly the case for a good chunk of the post-launch content for Valhalla, Forgotten Saga starts with an introduction in the Viking Era, with a new Northman reaching Ravensthorpe and thinking to settle in. This is Eivor, who apparently was a friend of Varin, Eivor's father, and thus is able to recognize her because he had visited her household when she was very young. In a surprising moment, Eivor hands Eivor a small but super precise reproduction of Suttungur's mead horn, which you might remember from the Jotunheim arc. It was the horn that was holding the mead that, beyond the mythological veil, was actually the technology needed to make the Seven Method work, which Odin stole from the Greco-Roman Isu. So of course Eivor is surprised to see that this Eivor guy is able to create objects from dreams, or should we actually call them genetic memories, but he actually answers that he created it based on a story that Varin had told him, and Eivor answers that this is exactly as Varin described it to her as well, which does make sense within the lore, because the mythological sequences in the game here, as we said, are how Eivor is processing Odin's genetic memories through her perception of Norse mythology based on her experience, which we now know includes this story told by Varin, which is why we see the same design for the mead horn in the Jotunheim arc. Eivor is also not keen on seers, so of course Valka appears, once again mistaking what's happening, that is, an artisan hearing stories about objects and then recreated them for something else, that is Eivor bickering with visions, so she's not really happy with him, though there is a tinge of mystery to this character who says that when he hears stories and objects, they're designed to speak to him in a language that he doesn't know but he understands, that he's able to recreate these objects so precisely without ever seeing them directly, and that in his house has so many objects that are so similar to the ones shown in Svartalfheim, including accurate representations of Eitri, the main city shown in Dawn of Ragnarok. So yeah, the mystery as to how he knows so much, how he is able to recreate everything so perfectly, how he does look like a dwarf, and also how he tried to trick Valka into giving her a recipe for the genetic memories triggering potions, and even the notion that his database page is Everold Settlement, like is there a non-settlement Everold somewhere? All those mysteries lie strong in him, but don't hang on to that thought too much, because there isn't much payoff to it in this game mode even after its end. If only this is a nice justification as to why he is able to recreate weapons from Niflheim and give them to Eivor in the Viking Era. Anyway, Valka gives the potion to Everold so Eivor can peruse it, and that's how we jump back in the myth worlds, but before that, the story is introduced by a text screen similar to the ones shown in Dawn of Ragnarok, and this is where the actual game mode starts immediately by making it super clear that this is a direct sequel to the events shown in the Dawn of Ragnarok DLC, and the reason for that is that the opening screen says that Baldr died by Surtur's hands, which is sort of true. That happened mostly by Sinmara's hands under Surtur's orders in the DLC, and interestingly enough, something I apparently had forgotten, back then Sinmara did state that when they killed Baldr, they stored his light, that is, his consciousness, in the Salakar artifact, and the quote-unquote rest of it was sent to Helheim, which, considering the ending of this story, kinda seems like they made a copy of his consciousness and sent it over to the Isu Hell in what is here called Niflheim for whatever reason. So by the end of Dawn of Ragnarok, something we didn't really highlight in our analysis of the DLC, it seems like either two copies of Baldr's consciousness had been generated for Surtur's and Loki's or Hel's purposes, or alternatively, Baldr's consciousness was broken in two parts, one of which was needed for Surtur's plan to turn Juno's abandoned tower into a weapon of mass destruction, and one that again ended up in Hel's control. So the opening crawl mentions that many thought that Odin's will had been broken after he found out Baldr was killed, and it indeed was for a moment before he exacted his revenge on Surtur. But this was not the beginning of his end, foretold by the dead witch. That's a reference to the Voluspa poem, where Odin is foretold to die during Ragnarok by a Völva, there is a seeress, which, as we already established within the AC lore, should be considered as the calculation that showed that the Isu Odin would have died at the hands of the Isu Fenrir during the Toba catastrophe. But like the scroll mentions, this still wasn't the time for the catastrophe told by the calculations. In fact, after letting Juno put her hands on the Salakar artifact in the hopes that such gesture would have generated an opportunity for the consciousness of his son to survive the Toba catastrophe, Odin, the shaper of worlds, filled with grief, still decided to once again try and find Baldr by reaching Hel and the territories she was presiding over, hoping to find the other part or copy of his consciousness, which would have allowed him to try and find some way to bring him back to life, which also matches what was established in the Animus Anomalies in Valhalla's main game. In fact, in one of the anomalies, Loki tells Alethea that Odin, the Mad One, is wandering in lands afar, meaning that he isn't in the territories controlled by the Asgardian or the Greco-Roman Isu, and he is searching for ways to resurrect his son Baldr, looking for any answer that could calm his sorrow. All this diversion was what actually allowed for Loki and Alethea to plan and calculate how to steal the Seventh Method and survive the Toba catastrophe on their own. But back to Odin, after knowing that he himself had started a process that would have led to the Toba catastrophe hitting the Earth, he still didn't care about anything else other than to save and resurrect Baldr, which also meant he wasn't caring that much about Asgard, on which Loki, his progeny, and the Greco-Roman and North African Isu forces were marching upon, and also didn't really care about the Asgardian Isu and even some of his own friends, as we'll see in the second part of this video. So we have a thoroughly grieving and angry father reaching what I originally thought to be an Isu territory here named as Niflheim, and now very much believe it's something else, as we'll see, and here we see him calling his raven Muninn, which is a callback to one of the two ravens owned by Odin from Norse mythology, that is Hugin and Muninn, who represented respectively his thoughts and his mind. Now in practical terms, I believe that this part with Muninn is here mostly to tell us we can't use our raven in the roguelike areas, but it also works in more abstract terms, not only because it makes up for a good introduction about Odin's motivations at the start of the game mode, but it also can provide us with elements that we can use to understand what Muninn represents beyond the mythological veil. Odin says that when Muninn is with him, his memory is sharp, but he can't take him to Niflheim. So my interpretation here is that beyond the mythological veil, much like in Norse mythology, Muninn represents Odin's mind, or his active mind if you will, and not being able to take him to Niflheim is the first hint we have here about Odin's mind, and especially Odin's memory not working properly every time he goes to Hel's realm. So of course, beyond the mythological veil, it wasn't an actual raven that kept Odin's memory sharp, nor his absence that degraded it, as we'll see later. Odin says that he cannot take Muninn, his own acting mind, to Niflheim. He can barely get himself through the warding wall, which is pretty much the border of Niflheim that separates it from the other realms, and he also can't take his equipment with him. All these are to explain the basis of gameplay here, but they are also here to tell us the underlying story element that is key to my, and not only my, interpretation of everything that happens in the game mode, and that is that Niflheim here, beyond the mythological veil, is not an Isu territory, it is a simulation. That is why Odin is leaving his quote-unquote acting mind outside, that is why he cannot bring his weapons with him, that is why there is a quote-unquote warden wall that needs to be crossed to enter, and especially that is why when Odin enters and dies, he can do it all over again, because this is a simulation that is run over and over again, with Odin getting in, trying to get to the piece of data that he is interested in, that is Baldr's consciousness, then being spewed out every time he fails. So that's how I see it. Of course there is way more to it, as we'll see, but we needed to have our filter through which we can look at things right at the start. From the looks of it, Niflheim is a simulation, but Odin's camp is not. That is why Muninn, who represents his mind and memory, can stay there. Odin even says it, he wouldn't risk it, because who else would remind him of his purpose if not his own memory? He needs to keep his acting mind outside the simulation because entering it is dangerous and he doesn't want to lose it, and the reason for such danger is that the simulation itself is run and controlled by the Isu Hell. Odin here is like a hacker, trying to enter the simulation digitally to get to Baldr's consciousness, which is supposedly located at the end of the simulation, here represented as Hel's castle, so he can resurrect him, but the host of the simulation, that is Hel, does not want that, and as we'll see especially in the second part of this video, she is also actively trying to wipe his digital memory every time before he exits the simulation, so that when he reverts to his physical self in what we see as his camp, he doesn't really remember most of what he experienced and thus reverts to his original state of mind before he entered the simulation. Even tiny elements like currencies of the game mode can be a hint to this. Memories, thoughts, and dreams are the only currency that carries on from Niflheim onto Odin's camp, which is possibly another touch to show that everything we see happening in Niflheim is not tangible and is just affecting Odin's mind, his thoughts, and memories. So each time Odin gets out of the simulation, he reverts to his original state of mind before he entered it, and this propels him to once again look for Baldr's data within the simulation in what seems to be an endless loop, which matches perfectly the concept of a roguelike game mode like this one, so kudos to the devs here, things look to be properly justified here. Or it's my headcanon talking, one of the two. But let's stop for a bit and have a look at what this simulation is about. Within the Norse mythology, Odin at some point cast Hel into Niflheim and gave her power over it, making it the world of those who died in disease and old age, and especially those that did not die a heroic death. And within the AC lore, it is not that different. In fact, the game mode does reference a few times that even here, it was Odin himself that handed this simulation, or by extension the device that creates this simulation, to Hel a good chunk of time before the events of Forgotten Saga, and even trapped her inside. And because Odin encounters a number of quote-unquote shameful or honorless dead while he's trying to enter and hack the simulation, it kinda seems like this simulation was originally created during the Isu time to forcibly store the consciousnesses of shameful or honorless Isu so that they couldn't harm anyone. It would have been pretty useful with Juno, but alas. And the warden of this simulation, or the device that hosts it, was indeed chosen by Odin to be Hel. Actually, this is even hinted at by Hel when she says that Odin gave her Niflheim, a quote-unquote world filled with the dishonored and other undesirables, that only then Hel worked to make it suit her taste and plans. But that was apparently a long time before the events we're seeing here, and Hel has changed the simulation and has adapted it to her own plan, which was creating a quote-unquote new kind of life, free from the fear of death, where everyone that accepted to follow her would have had their own rebirth, which does match the concept of simulation perfectly, being able to live a digital life forever without having the fear of actually dying. And of course, this also reminds almost directly of how some of the Asgardian Isu decided to use the Yggdrasil machine for that very purpose, that is, running the Valhalla simulation over and over and over again without the fear of actually dying. So it looks like Hel at least took some inspiration from that, even though I wouldn't say that she is using the Yggdrasil machine directly, as Loki in the Animus Anomalies said that Odin was looking far and wide for ways to resurrect Baldr, so the device generating the simulation wasn't likely located in Asgard. It's also interesting to note that according to the database, Hel's control over Niflheim and thus on the simulation requires a lot of her energy, which, over a long period of times, weakens her, which is why we see her pretty exhausted every time Odin succeeds in getting to the end of the simulation. Keeping that in mind, we can go back to the flow of events. Before trying to enter the simulation, Odin ponders about why he's there, helping players know what their objective is. These dialogues show his grief once again and his sheer determination, or obsession if you will, to, you guessed it, defy fate and get his son back because he had been killed too soon. So Odin hacks or enters the simulation, and following my interpretation, he finds different entities, or better, Isu consciousnesses within it, some good that shouldn't have been there probably, like that of the Shield Maiden, and some pretty villainous, which matches the idea of this simulation being actually a sort of digital prison. During one of these encounters, Odin is reminded that the rules of death are different here, supporting the idea of a simulation where everybody that dies is alive once again after the simulation is rerun, which is also what we see happening with the enemies and bosses. And so Odin reaches what we see here as the first boss, and especially his first encounter with Hel, where she is not actually showing herself, but is already questioning Odin as to why he has returned to this simulation and to face her. Within the game mode, Hel sends different animals to attack Odin, most of them wolves because, well, that's Odin's main fear, but through the different versions of this encounter, we get to know some more information about what is happening beyond the mythological veil. For example, we already saw the dialogue that hints at this being a simulation, but we can also see Hel already hinting at the chance of harvesting memories and planting a dream, in general tampering with one's memory, which is exactly what she's doing, as we'll see in the second part of this video. In another dialogue, after a few reruns of the simulation, Odin is saying he will keep reappearing into the simulation like Hel's creatures, to which she answers that he knows nothing of them, as not everything she does is driven by war. This is a reference to the ending of the game mode, where it's going to be explained that Hel is not running this simulation and tampering with Odin's memories for hostile reasons, for the most part anyway. Clearing the first area provides players with a second Saga page, which mentions that Baldr was hidden away in Niflheim because of Loki's treachery, another element that proves that this is a sequel to Dawn of Ragnarok, and the document also hints at some dark design on Hel's behalf, but nothing more substantial here. Later on, Odin moves on to the second area of the simulation and finds the ruler of that area, who within the Mythological Veil is Gunnar, the king of the gods that was betrayed by Shield Maiden or Valkyrie Brunhild in a poem of the Poetic Edda dedicated to her. Within the AC lore, Gunnar was promised a victory by Odin, only to be betrayed by him on the battlefield, and here, within the Mythological Veil, he appears as a monster that rebuilt himself from discarded flesh. Ew. But anyway, this encounter, in all its versions, doesn't seem to shed more light on Odin, Hel, or the simulation, so we can carry on. And so, moving on to the third area of the simulation, we get another Saga page describing Odin's exploits in the second one, where once again Hel tested Odin's resolve to reach the end and find Baldr's consciousness. The third area is the one that stores Nidhogg, or his consciousness, under my interpretation, and interestingly enough, the name of the location where Nidhogg lies is Utgardr Rots, which, if I'm not mistaken, should mean the roots of Utgardr, and you might remember that Utgard within the Mythological Veil was the name of the Isu city that Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva were living in while they were researching the 7 methods of salvation. Now, I do think this is just a coincidence, so much so that one of the areas of Hel's castle is also called Utgardr Hells, which I imagine to mean the Hell of Utgardr or Hel's Utgard, while the other areas of the castle bear different names. Also, the word Utgard means outyard, so yeah, probably no connection there. Nonetheless, Odin reaches said location within the simulation and meets Nidhogg, our favorite dragon here. Following our interpretation, this could be the consciousness of a honorless Isu, a potentially old one based on his character profile and his voice, who was forcibly stored in the simulation after some potential wrongdoing in the real world. After all, he speaks of terror, pain, and death, and in the subsequent encounters he also taunts Odin on killing him or his son, so... And thus, after another Saga page that confirmed that Nidhogg was a very old being, so I guess we could say the same of his consciousness, Odin moves on and gets to the fourth area of the simulation within the Mythological Veil of Eivor's perception, named as Hel's Castle or Helheim. This location is slightly more interesting lore-wise than the others because while it's still part of the simulation, it is an area that does provide a bit more information that could be useful to the analysis. For example, the second area of the castle showcases some of the designs of the Isu technology used in the territory we know as Svartalfheim, though they are likely just there as textures used to support the library environment of the castle, considering that some similar designs can also be found in Odin's camp. This library apparently contains the so-called Hel's Lore, a series of writings by Hel locked behind a cipher that are not really explained further, but might be a visual representation of her knowledge or even her consciousness located within the simulation. The cipher is even described as the Hither cipher, and apparently these quote-unquote writings of the Queen also feature observations on the manifestation of memory, or lack thereof, and alterations after the rise or rebirth of select creatures, which is exactly what she tried to do to Odin every time he tried to run and hack the simulation. There is also another document in Hel's castle where a character named Aud hears voices speak of an unlife that awaits and dreams of an eternity of mindless service, which could be another description of how this simulation is run and rerun, and the quote-unquote NPCs are bound to behave the same way over and over in an endless loop. And finally, over the various runs, Odin reaches Hel within the simulation, and already in their first encounter, Hel asks what Odin thinks about her changes to Niflheim, that is, her changes to the simulation after he entrusted it to her, or shall we say, after he trapped her inside, compared to how he remembered it in its original form. But here too, his memories are not working properly. He does not recall how it was in the past, because again, his memories were tampered with, but but the place feels familiar because it's likely the first encounter we see might not have been the first time he has met her in the simulation, and this is possibly another test that Hel is running on Odin to see if what she's doing is actually bearing effect on him. Odin asks once more where Baldr is, and Hel doesn't lie when she says that Baldr is dead and beyond his reach because technically he is not in a simulation, as we'll see in the second part of this video. Odin says that he will accept he can't reach Baldr only if he hears it from him directly, and Hel says that she knows for sure that even his words will not suffice, and again this is a reference to what will actually happen in the main ending, where Odin originally will not accept Baldr's words and still desire to get him back. But unfortunately, we have to stop here with the first part of our analysis. What do you think of our theories and hypotheses? Do you agree with them, or do you have other interpretations about the events that we have discussed up until now? Let us know in the comments below. Also, join us in our next and final video of this analysis, where we are going to analyze all the cutscenes from the failed runs, including a very interesting prophecy or calculation, the ending of the game mode featuring Baldr and some secret plans of his, and the repercussions that this story might have on the future, possibly on the upcoming final chapter of Eivor's story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in our next video.